Greetings to all of you, and welcome to this 20th session on Paul's letter to the Romans. I'm Pastor Timothy Muse, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio, and it's a joy to be with you as we continue to walk through Paul's pivotal and foundational letter of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to live this life of faith in the world, what it means to proclaim Jesus on a daily basis. One of the things that I keep reiterating and understanding where we've come to is that for many, Christ's return was supposed to be immediate, imminent. So there was really no reason to talk about a long-term life transformation in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. People figured that they would remain faithful, adhere to the teachings, whatever teachings they had around Jesus at the time, and that he would come back in a couple of weeks and everything would be great. Paul shows up on the scene about 20 years, 15 years after Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Maybe a little bit less than that. History is a little bit fuzzy in timelines, particularly in timelines around someone who, in the moment, was not historically relevant. I mean, other than the Bible, Jesus is only mentioned once in historical documents at the time by a writer by the name of Josephus. Josephus mentions Christ, mentions Jesus in one of his writings. So there's really not a lot. So historically, Jesus isn't really that big of a deal until we get later into his life. I say that historically, not spiritually or church-oriented. So Paul shows up on the scene sometime later. This is well after the realization that Christ isn't going to return right away. So there's this waiting, but there's an extended waiting. So how do we wait? How do we live in this waiting period? And we really, as Christians now, 2,000 years later, we're doing the same thing. We are asking that question. How do we live in the waiting period? We are still waiting for Christ to return. We've kind of come to this, we've kind of come to this easy place in our own existence to think that we are most likely going to die before Christ returns because we've had 2,000 years of experience around that. And maybe that's the case. I mean, maybe we will be in the church triumphant before the Messiah returns. But we can't guarantee that, nor can we guarantee when we know the timing of our own death. So we do need to be prepared, and we are constantly waiting. And that's our role, that's our job, that's our journey of faith, is to wait faithfully for the return of Christ, which means how do we live in this world? And that's what Paul is doing. That's what Paul is talking about here. That's really the foundational piece of the book of Romans. Acknowledging our brokenness, our need for redemption and grace. What does that look like in Jesus Christ? How do we get it? And then how do we live it out in the world? How does that affect us in the world? And that's really where we are at now in our study. We're in this heart, this meat and potatoes, this foundational piece of what it means to live as a Christian in the world today. And not just a Christian, but a faithful Christian, a strong Christian. I mean, there's multiple levels of Christians. There are those who proclaim Christ, but that proclamation has no impact on their life whatsoever. There are those who proclaim Christ, and it has a modicum of an impact on their life. It affects some areas. There are those who proclaim Christ, and it affects many areas of their life. And then there are those who proclaim Christ, and it affects every area of their lives. So Paul is speaking to the Christian, and Paul is laying out what this Christian life should look like, but what it means to fully buy into Christ, to fully be a Christian, to fully own this life, death, and resurrection, this proclamation. So that's where we are. That's what we're going to be continually looking at. And this is heavy stuff. This is dense stuff. But this is good stuff. So even though we may not get too far, we're getting a whole lot in it. So I certainly would encourage you to have a Bible before you, either in the written or in the digital, doesn't really matter, as long as you can follow along. And as well, you can choose whatever translation, whatever paraphrase you would like to use. That's okay. Having multiple varieties can help to bring about different nuances in the language. I use the New Revised Standard Version, so whatever reading I'm doing is going to come from that. It's going to come from the New Revised Standard Version. But that's where we're at. So we're in chapter 8 of Paul's letter to the Romans, and we've been here for a while now. And we've really been digging into this idea of life transformation, what it means to live in Christ, what it means to be filled with the Spirit, this duality between life in Christ and life in sin, gospel and law. In that the law shows us the level of our sinfulness. It shows us that we can't overcome our sinfulness, but then we have the grace that's given to us by Christ through the life, death, and resurrection. We have this grace given to us, and when we get this grace, we begin to realize that there's so much more for us. There's so much more for us to do, and so much more for us to experience in living in this life in the Spirit. So as we're living life in the Spirit, we're shown that we are transformed and we become something greater. We become part of God's community, part of God's grace. And that's really where we are. So I'm going to back up a little bit. I stopped in the middle of a thought process last time because we were really into a dense piece, and I wanted to make sure that we give it enough justice and grace. That's what happens, when you're eating boxed macaroni and cheese. You can eat it quick because you need the nutrients to move on. But when you're eating something dense like a filet or a good stew, you really want to savor it and give it the time. And that's where we are. We're savoring this. We're giving it the time. I'm going to back up a little bit. So this is Paul's letter to the Romans. It's the 6th book in the New Testament. Is that right? 5th book. 6th book. Yeah, 6th book. Sorry. I had a moment there. That's how it works. So you have the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in the New Testament, and then you have the book of Acts, and then you have the book of Romans. 8th chapter, we're going to start at the 12th verse. I'm going to back up just a little bit. So then, brothers and sisters, Paul says, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. But when you have received a spirit of adoption, when we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit, so that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. All right, so we began touching last week on this spirit-flesh thing. We've been working on that for a while. That's where Paul's really spent a lot of time. And he talks about being in the Spirit. When we are debtors to the Spirit, we live according to God's grace. Being a debtor means when we owe our existence to the Spirit of God, when we owe our salvation and our future and our vision to the Spirit of God, then we are debtors to that Spirit, to the Spirit of God's grace, versus being debtors to the flesh. Flesh, pleasure, desire, temptation. Again, and it's really important for us to grasp this. It's really important for us to grasp this. This is not to say that we completely deny the flesh and we die of thirst in 3 days. No. It means that we're not driven by the desires of the flesh. That we understand what the flesh needs in order to exist and survive, and that we understand what the flesh needs in order to move forward in a strong and healthy sense. We want the body to be as strong as possible and as fit as possible, not so that we can take in more, but so that we can use what God has given us for the greater glory of the greater. Okay? So when we are debtors to the flesh, we live according to the flesh. We live according to the desires of the flesh. And when we strive to have the desires of the flesh, then we can find ourselves breaking massive covenants, relationships, commandments that ultimately will lead to our death. Now, everybody's going to die. The flesh is going to die. But the death that Paul is talking about here is not the death of the flesh, but the death of the relationship with God. Okay? Jesus calls this the second death. We all experience the first death. Okay? The first death being the death of the body, the death of this machine that we've been given. Second death would be the death of our relationship with God, being kicked out of God's eternal presence. We don't fear the first death because we know it's going to happen. But we fear the second death because we know that the second death is what we don't want to experience. We don't want to be kicked out of God's eternal presence because that would mean that we would lose our eternity. So when Paul talks about being debtors to the flesh and that leading to death, when we're debtors to the flesh, that means that we strive to fulfill the desires of the flesh apart from the desires of God. And if we look at the 10 Commandments, if we really live into the desires of the flesh, then we're going to break all 10 of those commandments. I mean, we are. Because the flesh is going to drive us away from God. The flesh is going to drive us away from the Sabbath to gain more. The flesh is going to drive us to get what we want. Maybe it's through murder or stealing. The flesh is going to drive us to acts of sexual interaction with those maybe who are married or who don't want it, which would be the adultery aspect. We're going to lie about people. We're going to steal. We're going to covet. Okay, so if we're living in the desires of the flesh, if we're debtors to the flesh, then we're going to turn away from God's grace. But if by the Spirit, so if God's desire, God's life, God's focus comes into us, and we as Christians now, would consider that baptism, faith, proclamation, baptism, okay, then we put the deeds of the flesh to death. So we know we need to eat, but we don't need to stuff ourselves. We know that sexual intimacy and physical connection is very important. We do that in the midst of marriage. We do that in the midst of committed relationship. We understand and trust others' committed relationship. We don't try to take that. We don't lie about people in order to get what we want. We don't steal from them. We don't murder them. We honor the Sabbath day. We keep it holy. We honor our mother and father as best as possible in the circumstances we were raised up in. So putting to death the deeds of the flesh, the deeds of the body, this is not to say that we don't do them. I don't really think that it says we put to death the deeds of the body. Well, there are a lot of the deeds of the body that we have to do that we can't put to death. We have to eat. We have to sleep. But it is the desire to allow those deeds to rule. That's what we put to death. We put them in their place. Okay? God says to take care of the body as best we can. The body says, oh, look, I want to eat those dozen donuts. Well, sin and temptation says eat the dozen donuts. It's not going to bother you. We all know it's going to bother us. But saying, no, I want my body to be strong for God. I want my spirit to be strong for God. So I'm going to put to death the deeds of the flesh, that temptation, that desire. For all who are led by the Spirit are children of God. Now we kind of touched on this last time, and I want to reiterate it. This idea. Children of God. Okay? Being a child of God, being part of God's family. What we need to grasp here, what we need to understand here, is that in the Old Testament, prior to Christ, God was some far off being. And you got to God through going to the temple. You got to God through going through the priests. But God was far off. God was an unknown. This idea of being a child, being brought so close, being so intimately connected to God. This is earth-shattering. This is groundbreaking. This idea that God has come so close in, that God is now an intimate partner. When we call ourselves a child, then we are a child to our parents. Now, our parents are the ones that know us better than anybody else. Particularly when we're young. As we get older, obviously that changes, and that's the nature of aging, maturity, relationships. But when we're young, our parents, they're the ones that know everything about us. It's a very intimate relationship. So when we think about that parent-child relationship, that intimacy, now we're adding God into that intimacy, that intimate relationship. That God knows us through and through, but not from some far off, I created you and I'm watching over you like some kind of despot who's waiting to crush you when you sin, but something loving and caring and gracious. You didn't receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received a spirit of adoption. Adoption. You were brought into this family and made wholly part of it. We kind of touched on this before about what adoption meant. Adoption in the ancient world, and even adoption in the modern world, it's everything but DNA. Now, we don't change our DNA in adoption, but everything else we do. We adopt a child, and that child becomes fully part of the family, fully part of the succession, fully part of the order. They become heirs of the kingdom, heirs of the family. My wife and I, as some of you know, we adopted our daughter formally about 5 years ago. And when we did that, we set it up so that everything we have goes to her. She is the next in line. Now, we didn't give birth to her. She's not our genetic lineage. But through adoption, she became fully connected, fully part of the family. Everything. The only thing that isn't fully changed is her DNA. Now, keep in mind, when this is written 2,000 years ago, they had no idea what DNA was. Heck, DNA really wasn't part of the mainstream. It was known, but it really wasn't part of the mainstream when I was growing up. It wasn't until DNA could be tracked and traced and databases could be put together and we could identify strands of DNA that it really came into the forefront. Particularly now in genetic understanding of hereditary diseases and solving crime and a lot of things. But before that, but when you're adopted, you become fully part. It's not like you're now a guest in someone else's home. You become fully part of that home. You become part of that successive order. So in baptism, in the proclamation, and this is really what Paul is driving down here to, when you become a part of Christ, you are not just a guest in God's house. You are not just a guest at God's table. You are not just a guest wandering around the periphery, hoping you never wear out your welcome. You now become a full-fledged child, adopted into the family line. That can't be taken away. You become something so much more. You become part of the inner circle. Again, when you think about family, you think about the fact that family is that inner circle. They're the ones that are most intimately connected to each other, or should be, theoretically. And then you have close friends, and then you have acquaintances, and then you have business friends, and what have you, and all the way out. So in baptism, in proclamation, when we come into Jesus Christ, and our spirit is aligned with God, when we are led by the Spirit of God, we become intimate, inner circle children with God. We are adopted into God's heavenly kingdom. Now, again, for us, my friends, I grew up in the church, okay? I just turned 50 not too long ago, so half a century I have known Jesus Christ. First few years I really didn't know what that meant, but as I learned. So for half a century I have known what it means to have this God close. I have known what it means to be able to reach out and call upon this God to come near, and this God's promise will come near. I have known that. You probably have too. If you weren't baptized as a child, if you're listening to me now and you haven't been baptized, please reach out to me. Let us begin the conversation. Let us begin this beautiful, wonderful journey. But if you've always known God, then this is very foreign. Of course we're children of God. Of course we're intimately connected. But the people who are reading this, one, the barbarians who've never known God. The only thing they knew about God is the God of the Israelites was a God of wrath. Or a God of uselessness because the Romans took over. And the Jews, they've only known a God far away. They've only known a God that has been distant and connected through the priests and the Pharisees and the scribes. And it's a very expensive connection because I always had to pay for it. Then here's Paul talking about this idea, this intimacy with God, this intimate relationship with God being near, being adopted into God's family. Again, this may not seem like a whole lot for us. This is radically different. This is a God who's been told about for generations, far off and angry, now close in and loving and intimate. When we cry, Abba, Father, that is a very personal dad, Papa, okay? Again, God wasn't spoken about this way. God wasn't spoken to this way. God was spoken with high reverence and high words. You didn't call God Dad, Papa, Papa, whatever those words are. But when we receive a spirit of adoption, we receive the ability to cry out to God, as if God is Papa, Dad. We have the ability to address God as Dad. That's incredible. That is absolutely 100% unequivocally incredible. How is it that we can do that? How is it that we can call upon God in such an intimate way? That is what it means to have the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus inside of us. That is how radical the transformation is. We are now living in a place where God is so close, so connected. We are now living in a place where God is so much a part of who we are. That's incredible, brothers and sisters. It's beautifully and wonderfully incredible. It's something we can't even begin to comprehend and imagine, but it is, and it's beautiful and it's incredible. That is the promise. So this is and to think about that now, so how does that affect how we live? God is no longer far off there, out there, not really paying attention, sending out the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees who are going to whip people into shape and charge them outrageous amounts of money to save their souls. No, God is intimate right there. God is present. Ask yourself this. If you truly grasped that the maker of heaven and earth, that God was always right next to you, how would you live your life? How would you make decisions? I think we make a lot of decisions in our world because we don't think God is right next to us. We think that God's law is right next to us. We think that God's desire for us to be perfect is next to us. We act that way. I mean, in the tenor of my ministry, I've been spoken to many times, not with grace, but with law. And not because I had done something wrong, but because someone else had looked at me without having God next to them. That they felt that they could beat me or someone else down in order to feel better, rather than seeing that's not how God works. But if we thought about God being right next to us all the time, if we thought about God being next to us in the car, if God being next to us when we click online, if God being next to us when we start to talk to our partners or our children or do our job, how different would our life be? I mean, think about it. How different would our life be if we truly thought that God was sitting next to us all the time? But as Christians, that's what we have. And that is the promise. And that is something that is so far removed. This is radical, groundbreaking stuff that Paul is laying forth here. It is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. So it is the Spirit of God, we would call the Holy Spirit the living presence of God, attached to our spirit, our desire to know God formally and intimately, with bearing witness, speaking, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. What does it mean to be an heir? What it means to be an heir is that when the father passes away, or when the owner passes away. Now, I want to make sure that Paul is very clear. He is not talking about God dying. God doesn't pass away. But the vision is that when we become Christian, when we own the proclamation of Jesus Christ, then we become part of the succession of God. We become part of the heirship of God. Not heirship as in flying, but one who is an heir. Next in line. And those heirs don't come along easy. I mean, you don't just wake up one day and go to Walmart and walk by someone and go, hey, you know what? I want you to be the heir of my fortune. I know that there are Hollywood stories about that and maybe some fairy tales about it, but it doesn't usually happen that way. People usually just don't discriminately pass off their wealth to someone they don't know. When we adopt that spirit, then we become heirs of God. We become part of God's inner circle. We become part of what God is going to lay out. And what is the treasure of God? Redemption, perfection, eternity. So we don't have to wait for God to pass away in order to get what God is going to give us. When we become heirs of the kingdom, when the time is right, God is going to give us our inheritance, which is eternity, grace. That's the promise. Because we become joint heirs with Christ. And what's Christ's reward? Eternity, redemption, promise. So we stand with Christ as heirs of the kingdom. If in fact we suffer with him, so we may also be glorified with him. So again, and there's another thing I want you to be very clear about. This is really the first intonation of eternity with God. Most of the Jewish teaching in the Old Testament was temporal blessing, temporal curse. So you were blessed or you were cursed in this world. Okay? You were blessed or you were cursed in this world. If God loved you, you were rich, you were healthy, you had property, prosperity, resources. If God didn't love you, if God was angry with you for whatever reason, then God cursed you. I want you to think about the story of the blind man that Jesus encounters in John chapter 9, where the disciples bring Jesus a blind man and they say to him, "Teacher, who sinned, this man or his parents?" So physical ailments, so handicaps, so poverty was a curse from God. So when Jesus starts talking about taking care of the poor and the widow, these people are cursed. They're here because God put them here. Why would you go against God? If God said, "I want this person over here to be poor," then you darn well better stay away from them and not give them any food because you're going to anger God. Would you want to do that? Of course not. But the lie is that that's how God worked. It's not how God works. Actually, it's a lie and it's an excuse. So someone who is rich can oppress someone who is poor and then turn around and say, well, if God wanted them to be rich, they'd be rich. God must have cursed them. Well, there you go. So in the Old Testament, most of the ancient world, and really quite frankly, in a lot of our world today, we still think the same way, that it was temporal blessing, temporal curse. When you're dead, you're done, that's it, it's over. So everything was about this world, what you had in this world. But Paul is now expanding on a concept that Jesus brings in about this everlasting life, about this world being the stepping stone, the next step to the world to come, and that what we do in this world will reflect what will happen in the world to come. So now, how we interact with each other, how we treat each other, matters differently. So Paul is introducing, and actually he's not introducing, Jesus really introduces it, but Paul is refining it and taking it to the next level by saying, look, we suffer with him so that we might also be glorified with him. And how do we suffer with him? We suffer with him by doing what he tells us to do. Love our neighbors, tend to each other, care for each other. We're going to hear it, we hear it on Sunday morning. Take up your cross and follow me. We hear these things. And we get them because we have been drawn into this very inner circle, this very inner peace. We are children of God, heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. This is powerful stuff, my friends. This is life transforming. And it's meant to be. It's meant to be life transforming. We don't just get the boundary of the law. We don't just have God saying, okay, here's the fence that you can live in. Follow the law and I'm going to be happy. Because really, quite frankly, it's easy to follow the law and hate and be distant from God. We can show up on the Sabbath day and keep it holy, but it can mean nothing. We can honor our mother and father by not speaking ill of them and by ignoring them. Okay? But this is very different This is very much God right here with us. This is very much God transforming who we are on a daily basis. It's not just a boundary where God says, okay, this is the fenced-in backyard, go out and play while I go take a nap on the couch or I watch the U.S. Open. This is God with us, always. This is God part of who we are, always. This is life-changing. This is radical. And again, for us, it is so commonplace because we're so used to it. But for those who are hearing these words, this is freedom. This is freedom from oppression. This is freedom from tyranny. This is freedom from those who would keep God from those who need God. And it's these words that came back around in the Reformation. Martin Luther was a huge Pauline theologian. He felt that, he really leaned into Paul's words, and he really took a lot from Romans. Understanding, again, because what had happened was, the church throughout time, throughout its 1,500-year history, kind of adopted this same kind of structure that the Jews had before Christ came. A lot of middle people between God and the people. God was far off. In Catholicism in the late 1400s and early 1500s, what we would call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, God was very far off. God was very wrathful. God was very vengeful. There wasn't a whole lot of grace. And it wasn't easy to get to God. God was distant. Luther came along and really re-enlivened Paul's theology around this intimate, connected, loving, present God. And I think that's something that we really, we don't get. We don't get the significance of what we have. We take it for granted. And it's awesome that we can take it for granted, but we also take it for granted. The significance of God with us, of this intimate relationship, that we can go to the maker of heaven and earth and say, hey, Dad, hey, Papa, I need you, I want you, I want to be close to you, come close to me, and that God responds is incredible. It's massively, uberly incredible. Now, I think it is important, I think it is important to understand, and I'm not, please don't hear me as bashing the Roman Church. 1,500 years of history, the Lutherans didn't get it all right either, the last 500 years, okay? So I think we can always look back in our history, and we can, even our own history. We can look back in our own history and we can pick apart where we got it wrong. But really, quite frankly, it made sense in the moment. And I think the only reason, the thing that we look back in history is if we have to bring about a righting an injustice, we should. But it also should teach us how we move forward, okay? But what I want to make sure that we're clear about, and oftentimes this can be muddied, and I want to make sure that we're clear. God is God, as Paul is laying forth, as Jesus laid forth, as the scriptures lay forth. Religion, at its core, is a man-made structure, a human-made structure, to understand that which is not understandable. To give structure to something that is so vast. God. Religion, because we as humans need structure and order, we create structure to understand God. And that's what happened in the Old Testament. That's what happened in the New Testament. That's what happened in church history. There are structures to understand God. There are many religions out there to understand God. And that's okay. No one religion has all the truths of God. I say that as a religious leader. We all have our strengths and we all have our weaknesses, our strengths and our blind spots. But one of the things to keep in mind is that when the structure becomes a thing of worship, that's when it's problematic. We study the Bible, we study it from a Lutheran perspective, of course, but we study the Bible from a biblical perspective to make sure that it is God that we are raising up and not a structure. to make sure that it is God that we are worshiping and not a structure. That is very important for us to understand. It's very important for us to grasp. And when we come to places like this, it's really difficult because this idea of a God close to us, this intimate God, is very uncontrollable. Religion looks to control. And so we have to be very careful to make sure that whatever structure, isn't looking to control something so beautiful. So when we come back to these texts and we understand the power and the nature of what God is bringing forth here, the power and the nature of who God is here, we have to make sure that we don't allow our structure to get in the way of this and to change it, because that would not be fair and that would not be right. All right, my friends, again, I've thrown a lot at you. Heavy stuff, good stuff. I want you to take the opportunity to, kind of live into it a little bit. Let it ruminate. If you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll do the best I can to answer them. My contact information will come up at the end of this session. So please feel free to use it as much as you need to. God bless you. You have a great day and a great week. And I pray that this is powerful stuff and you can see just the joy of what we have and what God offers us. Have a great day. Talk to you soon. God bless you.